Welcome to The Frozen Truth. I'm Noah, and a new original story awaits you. When the camp's section chief announced that Michael Reed would be sent out at dawn to a work site that men didn't come back from, the man who gave that order had no idea that within a few months he himself would be standing in a courtroom. In handcuffs, in front of dozens of reporters who had shown up expecting a completely different story. When the junior guard, Officer Lane, called Reed by his last name in front of the entire formation instead of shouting his number, inmate 1437, Michael knew immediately that something was wrong. After 6 years in the camp, he had gotten used to being a number. A man's name was only given back to him before one of two things: release or disaster. No one was coming to release him. The gate buzzer sounded 8 times in a row. The prisoners lined up. The morning was bitter, a deep midwinter cold that packed itself into your throat like a gag. Section Chief Drake stood on the steps of the command building, hands clasped behind his back, wearing the kind of smile that over the years Reed had learned meant exactly one thing. Someone was about to have a very bad day. Reed stepped forward. Michael stepped out. His boots crunched on the packed snow. 40 men watched his back, some with sympathy, some with that particular kind of camp curiosity that surfaces whenever misfortune lands on someone else. "New orders came through," Drake said, unfolding a sheet of paper slowly like he was reading a sentence. "Inmate Michael Reed is to be transferred to the far site, the 40-mile post, as crew lead, escort, no radio, no communication, return based on output quota." Somewhere in the line, someone exhaled, not from envy, from dread. The 40-mile post wasn't a work site. It was a place from which, in winter, almost no one came back. The ones who made it out were the lucky few who survived a chainsaw accident or a careless case of frostbite. Men were sent there when no one wanted to put them on trial a second time, but no one planned on keeping them alive either. Reed's face didn't move. He'd learned that discipline in the Army Medical Corps, and later digging through the rubble after a mine explosion, where he spent 3 days pulling people out from under collapsed concrete slabs and never once let himself scream. His face was the last thing that still belonged to him. He wasn't going to give that up too. "When do we leave?" he asked, calm. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. Drake folded the paper. "Be grateful, Reed. They're trusting you with a high-responsibility post." He turned and walked back into the warmth of the command building without waiting for a response. The snow under Reed's boots suddenly felt foreign, as if the ground already knew he wouldn't be staying on it much longer. That evening he was called into the infirmary, a routine checkup before transfer. The former Army medic, now the camp's civilian doctor, Dr. Paul Crane, took his blood pressure longer than necessary and didn't let go of his wrist. "Third strike," he said quietly, not looking at Michael, pretending to study the monitor readings. "I heard it. The whole camp heard it. But I heard something else too." The old man finally looked up, and in his eyes was something Reed had only seen once before. The day they brought in the body of a young inmate, beaten to death during an escape attempt that never happened. The order didn't come from camp administration, it came from the regional office, from the deputy state attorney himself. Reed's heart, the same heart he'd learned to hold steady through 15 surgeries under enemy fire, skipped a beat. "Sterling," he said. Not a question, a statement. "I didn't say any names." Crane turned away, putting the monitor back in the cabinet with slow, deliberately calm movements. "But you heard the same thing I did. Someone up the chain got scared, and when men like that get scared, Michael, they don't file a request to reopen a case. They file a request for the 40-mile post." Why would anyone be scared now? The case has been closed for 6 years. 6 months ago, your lawyer filed a complaint with the State Bureau of Investigation. Crane's voice dropped almost to a whisper. I overheard the deputy warden on the phone with someone, said an inspector's coming, said they need to handle the witness problem. I didn't connect it to you until today. Michael said nothing. For 6 years he'd filed complaints no one answered, and now it seemed one of them had finally landed. Too late to save him through the normal channels, but early enough to scare the people who wanted him silent forever. Is that hers? Crane asked suddenly. Michael silently pulled out a worn military dog tag on a cord. The metal was warm from his body. He'd worn it without taking it off for 15 years, since his service. On one side, a stamped unit number and personal ID. On the other, a photograph glued under a thin pane of glass, cracked in one corner. A young woman with short hair, laughing by a river. Ellen. Hide it better, Crane said. Then he leaned toward his desk drawer and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in waxed paper, handing it over discreetly. Inside, a folding knife, a couple of packets of water purification tablets, some cordage. If you come off that work site alive and there's any distance to cover, head into the back country. You've got better odds there than here. You're telling me to run. I'm telling you to survive. For the first time in the conversation, the old man looked him straight in the eye. I've treated you for 6 years. You're not a killer, Michael. I figured that out a long time ago. And since that's true, somebody needs to live long enough for everyone else to figure it out too. The transfer convoy rolled out at 6 a.m., exactly as ordered. 2 guards and a driver took him out on an old military truck through the snow, straight towards the backcountry, where there was no cell signal and the nearest town was hundreds of miles away. At the 23-mile mark, the road dipped into a hollow. The truck got stuck on the ice and one of the guards climbed out to push. Reed had been waiting 2 days for exactly this moment. He didn't run. He disappeared. The way he'd been trained. No panic, no noise, using the seconds when the escort's attention scattered. A jump from the footboard, a deep roll into the snow behind a boulder, and the wilderness swallowed him the way it swallows anything that comes to it uninvited. After that, time stopped being measured in hours. It became a question of how much longer he could walk without frostbite, without food, without warmth. For 7 days he walked east, toward an old hunting cabin a fellow soldier had once told him about, someone from his old life, back when Reed wasn't a convict but an army medic who could set an IV on a man bleeding out under mortar fire in 20 minutes flat. The wilderness didn't scare him. The wilderness was more honest than people. It only killed the ones who didn't respect it. On the 8th day, with nothing left of his rations but crumbs and the sky going heavy with snow light by noon, Michael heard an engine, a helicopter. It was flying low, struggling, clearly fighting ice building up on its rotor blades. An old civilian model, no markings. Reed froze under a cedar, watching the helicopter sway through the air like a wounded bird, losing altitude in short, jagged drops. "It's going down," he whispered out loud, the first English words he'd spoken in 8 days aside from whatever he'd muttered in his sleep. The aircraft clipped the treetops on a ridge 1.5 miles away, and the sound of the impact, dull, terrible, echoing off the snow-covered slopes, sent every bird within miles into the air at once. Reed ran. He reached the crash site in 20 minutes, fast for that terrain, almost heroic for a man who hadn't had a hot meal in 8 days. The helicopter lay on its side among splintered spruce trees, nose crushed, tail boom snapped at an unnatural angle. The smell of jet fuel, burnt metal, and, sharper than both, blood drifted from the wreckage. The pilot showed no signs of life, chest crushed by the control column, eyes fixed open on a sky that had failed him. Reed checked for a pulse at the carotid artery, an old habit that never left him even in sleep, and shook his head. There was nothing he could do here. The second passenger was alive. A woman, somewhere in her 30s, half-pinned under a mangled seat, wearing the jacket of a state investigator, her face streaked with blood, her left leg twisted at an unnatural angle, an open fracture. Bone had torn through fabric and the snow around it was already staining dark. She was unconscious but breathing, a wet, broken sound Reed had heard 1,000 times before, meaning the lung was bruised but not punctured. This time, not much but some. He worked the way he always worked when every thought shut off except one. Keep this person alive. A tourniquet above the knee to stop bleeding from the femoral region, thankfully not directly damaged, but the risk was there. Splints improvised from dashboard fragments and a seat belt, locking the leg so the broken bone couldn't shift. Clearing her airway of blood, turning her head to the side. All of it in 7 minutes, bare hands, in -22 cold, without a single wasted motion. When the woman moaned, drifting up toward consciousness for the first time, he was already pulling off his own coat to wrap around her, because without warmth, nothing else would matter. Easy, easy, he said, the way he used to say it to the wounded under rubble 15 years earlier. You're alive. That's what matters. She couldn't hear him, but he wasn't really saying it for her. He was saying it for himself. The first time in 8 days, he let himself believe there was still something in this forest worth saving. Under the wreckage of the tail section, among scattered belongings, Reed spotted a tablet in a cracked case and a thick cardboard folder bound with a rubber band. Papers of some kind, by the look of it. No time to go through them now. He stuffed both into his backpack along with the pilot's first aid kit. He'd sought out what survived later, and gathering the woman into his arms as carefully as his exhausted muscles allowed, set off toward the cabin. The snow picked up. 40 miles to the west, in a warm office with oak furniture, a man named Sterling was just then setting his phone down, having learned that a helicopter carrying senior investigator Anna Reeves had gone off the radar over the wilderness. He didn't know, couldn't know, who had found her first. She opened her eyes on the third day, a low ceiling of blackened logs, the smell of pine resin, smoke, and something herbal. A St. John's wort tincture Reed had been brewing on the stove for 3 days straight while changing her dressings. A draught stirred the old sheepskin coat hanging over the cabin's only window. Her leg didn't hurt. Everything else did. And the pain was, strangely, the right kind, the kind that says, you're alive, your body is fighting. Anna Reeves tried to sit up and immediately saw him, a man with several days' stubble, a faded prison uniform with a number stamped on the chest, sitting by the stove, whittling a branch with a knife, shaping it into a new splint brace. Memory came back in fragments, the engine's roar, the bank, the crack, darkness, and hands. Someone's strong, steady hands, keeping her from slipping into nothing. "Who are you?" Her voice came out hoarse, unfamiliar. Reed didn't flinch, didn't turn sharply. He'd long since learned not to make sudden movements around wounded people. It frightens them worse than pain does. "The one who found you," he said. "Lie still. You've got an open break in your shin. I set it. The wound is clean, but if you keep moving, it'll get worse." She looked down at her leg, saw the rough but careful splint, the clean bandage, and somewhere underneath the fear, a flicker of professional recognition surfaced. A stranger doesn't wrap a wound this well. "Are you a doctor?" "Was a medic. Army." "Was." He paused, just long enough for her to notice it. "Right now I'm an escaped convict, sentence for murder. If you want to scream, go ahead. But for 100 miles in every direction, nobody's going to hear you except the wolves." Anna went still. Her hand drifted instinctively toward her belt where a sidearm used to sit, but the holster was empty, sitting on a shelf along with her tablet and uniform jacket. "I'm not a killer," he added, noticing the gesture. "If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be dead in that cabin. I carried you 5 miles. He stood, poured tincture into a cup and held it out. "Drink. You need fluids. You lost a lot of blood." She didn't take the cup right away. For several long seconds they just looked at each other. An investigator and a fugitive. 2 people thrown together in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, under circumstances no court would believe if they ever had to explain them. Then she took the cup. Her hands were shaking, but she took it. Over the following days, she watched him, with the wariness of an investigator trained to find a lie in every gesture, and found none. He didn't lock the door. He kept the knife within her reach in case she ever decided she needed to defend herself. He shared the last of the crackers from his pack while living off herbal tea and whatever small game he could catch in snares. When her fever spiked on the 5th day and the wound began to inflame despite everything he tried, he stayed awake for 2 nights straight, changing compresses, boiling water for antiseptic from foraged herbs, and the little alcohol he found in the pilot's medical kit. One day, while she helped him redress a cut he'd stitched on his own forearm, an injury from working a trap line, she noticed the worn army dog tag on a darkened cord around his neck. "What's that?" she asked, mostly just to fill the silence. He covered it with his palm, an automatic, almost protective motion. "A memory," he said shortly, closing the door on further questions. Anna didn't push. Professional instinct told her some things people had to hand over on their own without being forced. But she remembered the gesture. People don't hide jewelry like that. They hide things that still hurt. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one night when the fever had eased and a storm howled outside the cabin walls. "I'm an investigator. If they find me here with you, it won't help your case. It'll destroy it." He fed another log into the stove, and for a second the flame lit up his face. Sharp cheekbones, a scar above one eyebrow, the eyes of a man who had seen too much death to fear it again. "I have nothing left to destroy," he said quietly. "I don't have a case anymore. What I have is this. I don't let people die if I can stop it. It's not a choice. It's the one true thing left in me." "And what's the false thing?" He gave a short, joyless laugh. "My name in that verdict, it says murderer. That's a lie I never chose." Anna stayed quiet. The professional in her wanted details, wanted to verify, to cross-check. The human part of her, still trembling from the crash, simply listened to the wind howling and thought that she had rarely, if ever, met someone capable of this kind of calm self-sacrifice. And certainly never among the people her job had trained her to suspect. "Who were you convicted of killing?" she finally asked. "My wife." He didn't look away. "Ellen." The name dropped into the cabin's silence like a stone into a well. Anna felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The man who had saved her, who had held her life in his hands for 8 days, had been convicted of murdering his own wife. "Tell me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "Not tonight," he finally said. "Tonight you need to sleep, not listen to a story you're under no obligation to believe." By the end of the 2nd week, the fever had broken for good. The wound began to close, and Anna, leaning on a makeshift crutch, could manage a few minutes standing at the cabin's threshold, breathing the freezing air, watching Reed check his snare lines on the edge of a clearing. Her strength was coming back, and with it, the habit of thinking. "My things," she said one morning. "That folder, the tablet, where are they?" Reed silently brought the backpack and laid the contents on the table. The cracked tablet, screen dead, battery drained. No way to charge it here. And the thick cardboard folder bound with a rubber band, which had somehow survived the crash intact. Anna untied it with trembling fingers. Inside, printouts, document copies, a few photographs held together with a staple. She flipped through several pages, routine material from an illegal logging case she'd been working for the past 6 months. Fake tenders, a scheme funneling reforestation funds through contracting companies, names of officials she already knew well. And then an old, yellowed page. A copy from an archived case file she'd requested a month earlier, checking whether the scheme used 6 years ago in a similar embezzlement case matched what she was seeing now. On the page, a photograph from a convict's file. A man's face, younger, clean-shaven, but the same cheekbones, the same direct, heavy gaze. Michael Reed. Murder. First degree. Anna slowly raised her eyes to the man standing by the stove 10 feet away, plucking a rabbit for stew, with no idea that she was holding his own face from 6 years ago in her hands. "Reed," she said. Her voice cracked. "Michael Reed." He froze, knife in hand. "How do you know my full name?" She held the page up so he could see it. "Because I read your case file a month ago. I'm investigating an old embezzlement scheme tied to the state reforestation fund. A case from 6 years ago where the key witness to the embezzlement was your late wife, and the prime suspect in her murder was you." The cabin went very quiet. Only the crackle of logs in the stove, and outside the wind howling, indifferent to the fact that two people's last assumptions about each other were collapsing in that moment. "So that's why you were flying out here," he said slowly. "Not because of me. I didn't even know you were alive and free." She shook her head, still holding the page with his photograph. "I was flying to Cedar Hollow to interview a former forest ranger who, according to our intel, could confirm the fake contract scheme. Your case landed in my hands by accident as an old precedent for the same pattern. I hadn't even had time to really study it." She lowered the page. "Now, it looks like I'll have to." Michael slowly sat down on the bench, the knife clattered onto the table. "Then you're the first person in 6 years who's holding my case file and isn't working for the people who fabricated it." She asked him to tell her everything. Not because she had to, but because her professional instinct, sharpened by years of investigative work, was telling her this case, the one she had been treating as an old precedent, ran far deeper than a single line in an archive file. He told it slowly, without drama, the way people describe a long-healed wound that still aches in the cold. Ellen had worked as an economist for the Regional Reforestation Fund. Quiet work. Numbers, reports, subsidy reconciliations, until the day she found a discrepancy in the paperwork. A contracting company called Cascade Forestry Group had received a subsidy for reforesting a plot of land that, according to satellite imagery, had never actually been replanted. The money went out. The forest never came back. She dug deeper and found 4 more plots like it processed over the past 3 years, totaling tens of millions of dollars. She came home and said, "Mike, I found something that makes me sick," Reed said, staring into the fire, his voice catching for the first time in the whole conversation. She was an honest person. She wrote up a formal report and gave it to the fund director. 2 weeks later, her boss passed it on to the state attorney's office the way you're supposed to. A week after that, Ellen died in a car accident on a forest road. Official cause, excessive speed, black ice, brake failure. He laughed bitterly. They inspected the car for 2 days. Conclusion, worn brake components. I knew that car. I serviced it myself every 6 months. Those brakes were 3 months old. Did you report it? I did. I found a flash drive in her belongings, a full copy of everything she had collected. I brought it to an investigator I trusted more than anyone else in my life. A man I'd grown up with, been friends with for 20 years. Bell, Anna said quietly, remembering the name from the archive file. Andrew Bell. Reed said the name like it left a taste of metal on his tongue. I gave him the flash drive, asked him to look into it quietly, no noise, so we wouldn't spook whoever was involved. 3 days later, I was arrested for Ellen's murder. Bell was the key witness. He testified that my wife and I had a loud fight the night before she died, that I had debts, that I'd threatened her with divorce and a fight over assets. None of it was true, but the lab found trace alcohol in my blood, even though I hadn't had a drink in 3 years, since my concussion. And investigators found tools in my garage with marks consistent with tampering with a brake system planted. I don't know how they got there. I only know they weren't there the last time I'd been in that garage 2 days before Ellen died. And the flash drive? Anna asked. The one you gave Bell? Gone. They never even mentioned it at trial. For the first time in the conversation, he looked her straight in the eye. But at trial, they did mention a man who personally showed up to make sure the case got closed fast and quiet. The deputy district attorney at the time, young, ambitious, Gregory Sterling. Anna felt her throat go dry. Sterling, the same name on half the documents in her own investigation. The same man who, 2 weeks earlier, had been introduced at a state bar function as the leading candidate for state attorney general. In the regional capital, in an office with oak panelling and the heavy scent of expensive cologne, Gregory Sterling was listening, for the 8th time in 2 weeks, to an update on the search for the missing helicopter, and with every update, his patience grew thinner. We found the wreckage, Andrew Bell reported, standing in the stiff posture of a man uncomfortable in his own rank. Pilot's dead. Investigator Reeves hasn't been located. Search teams are sweeping a 12-mile radius from the crash site. 12 miles in 2 weeks. Sterling never raised his voice. It was beneath him, but there was more threat in that quiet tone than in any shout. Andrew, do you understand that if Reeves is found alive and she gets her hands on those documents she was flying to Cedar Hollow to retrieve, neither of us is looking at a career anymore. We're looking at prison. I understand. Then explain to me why the search is concentrated in that sector and not in the direction the aircraft would actually have drifted if the tail rotor failed. Sterling turned to the window, not facing him. You have experience in that terrain. Use it. Point the search where she definitely won't be found, and if she is found, make sure it's our people who find her, not search and rescue, with reporters trailing behind. Bell's jaw tightened. And if she's alive, then you already know what to do. Sterling finally turned around, and there wasn't a trace of doubt in his eyes. Only the cold calculation of a man for whom a human life had long since become a single-line item in a risk budget. You've done this before, Andrew. 6 years ago. I don't see why this time should be any different. Bell walked out of that office with the face of a man who'd just been forced to sign another deal with the devil. The same deal he'd signed once before out of envy and ambition, and now kept renewing out of pure fear. In the outer office, sorting papers, the young assistant Dana Lake heard more through the half-closed door than she ever wanted to. She'd worked for Sterling for 8 months, and in that time had learned not to ask questions out loud, though she hadn't unlearned how to ask them to herself. When Bell walked out without looking at her, Dana did what she'd already done twice in the past month. She waited until the office emptied, then photographed several pages from a folder marked "Confidential" sitting on the secretary's desk, copies of orders redirecting the search teams. She wasn't entirely sure why she was doing it. She only knew that her predecessor, also young, also dutiful, had quit voluntarily 6 months earlier, 2 days after accidentally seeing the wrong documents, and ever since, Dana had kept copies of anything that struck her as strange, in case one day that strangeness turned out to be a crime, and she had to explain why she hadn't said anything. That same day, 70 miles from Sterling's office, a forest ranger named Tom Hunter was checking trail cameras set up to monitor the local marten population. The camera covering the burned-out hollow where the helicopter had gone down had triggered 11 times over the past 2 weeks. And not just for foxes and wolverines. One frame, taken on the day of the crash, showed a man carrying another person in his arms, with the wreckage of the tail boom visible in the background. Tom whistled, studying the photo on the camera's small screen. The search and rescue team that had combed this sector a week earlier had found nothing but wreckage and the pilot's body, which meant the second passenger had either survived and walked out on their own, or, far more interesting, someone had carried them out. He saved the memory card in his shirt pocket and decided for now to keep it to himself. Not because he wanted to hide anything. After 20 years working these woods, he'd simply learned that the wilderness doesn't like its secrets talked about before their time. By the start of the 3rd week, Anna could stand for a few minutes without the crutch, leaning on a homemade cane instead. The wound had scarred over, rough but solid. Between her and Reed, a particular kind of trust had formed, the kind that isn't built from words, but from what two people survive together. She watched him stay up at night listening to the sounds of the wilderness, ready to defend her against anything. He watched her, despite her weakness, methodically rebuilding the case file in her memory, page by page, preparing for the day she'd walk out of there and start acting. "If I make it back to the city," she said one day, stitching a torn sleeve of her uniform jacket with a needle from the medical kit, "I'm going to reopen this case myself. Not because I'm 100% sure I believe you. Taking someone's word for it isn't my job. I'm an investigator, not a jury. But the facts in your file, I'm obligated to recheck. And a recheck is a chance, one you never had 6 years ago. I have the authority to open an inquiry on new evidence alone. The flash drive," Reed said. "If it still exists, it's with Crane, the camp doctor. I gave him a duplicate the first year I was inside, the moment I realized I could trust him, hidden in the lining of his medical bag. They search a doctor's bag less often than they search any inmate's. I don't know if he kept it. If he did, it'll be the first piece of physical evidence linking the old case to the new one." Hope crept into her voice, the careful kind people are afraid to say out loud for fear of jinxing it. "But first," she added, "we need to get out of here alive, and I need to be found by people who aren't Sterling's." Outside the cabin, the wilderness sat in heavy, snow-muffled silence, as if it were listening to those words itself, weighing which side to fall on. They reached a geologist's winter camp in their 4th week out. Anna could walk on her own by then, leaning on a stick, though the leg buckled with every careless step. Reed had been planning to make it to a weather station, then call the city, using her name, her authority, not his. The plan was simple. She would walk out alone, call for help, explain everything herself without mentioning him until they knew who could be trusted. The plan fell apart 1.5 miles from the camp. Snowmobiles appeared out of nowhere. 3 vehicles, men in search and rescue uniforms, and 2 in plain clothes carrying rifles, which was, to put it mildly, excessive for a rescue operation. Leading the group was Andrew Bell himself, in a heavy coat over his uniform, wearing the face of a man who had long since stopped sleeping soundly. "Reeves!" he shouted, spotting them from distance, and something in his voice Reed couldn't quite place right away. Relief or fear? Anna stepped forward, leaning on her cane. "Andrew, Her voice was firm despite the weakness. "This man saved my life. He carried me out of that helicopter. He treated my leg for 3 weeks. He shared his last food with me. I want that on record from the very start." Bell looked at Reed, a long, heavy look, mixing recognition, guilt, and something close to panic. "Reed," he said, one word. "Hello, Andrew," Michael said, with no warmth at all. "Been a while, not since you lied under oath." One of the men in plain clothes, Reed recognized them by their bearing, not their uniforms, field agents, not rescuers, stepped forward and without warning struck him behind the knees with a rifle stock. Michael went down into the snow. "What are you doing?" Anna shouted, lunging toward him, but a second agent caught her by the shoulders. "Ma'am, you need medical attention," Bell said. False concern thick in his voice. "You spent 3 weeks held captive by an armed fugitive. You've been through severe trauma, and you may not be able to assess the situation objectively." "I'm an investigator, Andrew, not a hysterical schoolgirl," Anna snapped, but she was already being turned toward the snowmobile, no one listening. Reed was cuffed face down in the snow at gunpoint, despite making no move to resist. The last thing he saw before his face was pressed into the snow was Anna's expression, frightened, furious, and helpless. At the regional hospital where she was flown that same day, Anna was received like a hero, a survivor of a plane crash, 3 weeks a hostage of a dangerous criminal. That phrasing made it into the first press release before she'd given a single official statement. When Bell came to her hospital room the next day with a bouquet of flowers and the look of a caring colleague, she was still weak from the surgery on her leg. The surgeons had rebuilt the bone from scratch, noting that the crude field splint, for all its roughness, had saved her from amputation. "You should rest before the interview," he said, sitting by her bed. "The Bureau wants your statement as soon as possible. Given the circumstances, the stress, the medication you're on, I'd recommend not getting into details that might sound debatable." "What details, Andrew?" She looked straight at him through the fog of painkillers. "That Reed saved my life, that he treated me for 3 weeks at the risk of his own freedom and his own life. That's not a debatable detail. That's a fact I will swear to under oath." Bell went quiet, studying the bouquet he himself had brought. "Anna, you went through a trauma. Sometimes people in captivity develop an attachment to the person holding them. It's called—" "I know exactly what it's called, Andrew Dmitrievich." Her voice turned to ice. "I know the difference between Stockholm Syndrome and a sound professional analysis of the facts. I'm an investigator with 10 years on the job. Don't try to lecture me on trauma psychology when your actual goal is to talk me into staying quiet." Something that looked, for a second, like shame flickered in his eyes, then vanished, smothered under his usual self-justification. "Just be careful how you phrase things," he said, standing, "for your own sake." He left without looking back, and Anna lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling that cold, methodical fury build inside her. The kind that in her line of work was far more useful than any emotion. 2 days later, at a preliminary hearing on charges of unlawful imprisonment, Reed was brought to the district courthouse under heavy guard, as if he were a threat to the entire building, rather than a man sitting head down in cuffs on a bench. In a room packed with reporters, a young, ambitious deputy prosecutor, clearly acting on someone else's instructions, gave a long speech to the cameras about a dangerous individual who had exploited an aviation tragedy to hold a representative of the state hostage in order to escape his rightful punishment. No one asked why this dangerous individual hadn't been carrying a weapon. No one asked why the woman he had supposedly held hostage looked, in the single photograph that leaked to the press, not frightened but gaunt and weak, like someone recovering from serious trauma, not someone who had survived violence. Reed listened to the charges in silence, staring at a single point on the floor. The only sign of emotion, the whitened knuckles of his cuffed hands. As he was led out of the courtroom, someone in the back rows shouted, "Animal!" He didn't turn around. He'd long ago learned not to turn toward the shouts of a crowd that didn't know and didn't want to know the truth. At the detention centre, he was placed in solitary to avoid contact with other suspects, given the severity of the charges. On the third night, 2 men in plain clothes came to see him. Not investigators, not lawyers. One of them, heavy-set with heavy fists, hit him in the stomach without a word. "Say hello from Gregory," the second one said, watching Reed sink to the floor of the cell. "He wants you to understand, even if you're convicted on the kidnapping charge, you might not live long enough to hear the sentence. Accidents happen in detention, especially to people who talk too much to investigators about old cases." It was probably the worst night of all 6 years. Not because of the pain. He knew how to endure pain. It was because, for the first time in years, he'd had hope, and someone was trying to beat that hope out of him, along with everything else. When they left, he lay on the cold floor of the cell, pressing a hand to his bruised ribs, and felt for the worn dog tag, warm from his body, the one thing that hadn't changed. He clenched it in his fist so hard the metal pressed into his palm, and whispered his wife's name into the dark. Not like a prayer, like a vow. "I won't give up, Ellen, not now, not when somebody finally believes me." Anna checked out of the hospital on crutches officially to recover at home. In reality, to start her own investigation, keeping the official inquiry at arm's length. She knew that openly challenging Sterling without proof would mean repeating Reed's fate from 6 years earlier. The first thing she did was find a way to reach Crane, not directly through the camp's official line, which was almost certainly monitored, but through an old colleague, the head of a neighbouring region's medical department, asking, as a friendly favour, for a routine check on Dr. Crane's credentials for an unrelated review. In the conversation that followed, she carefully, without asking anything directly, let Crane know through a third party that Reed's case was being reopened and that he could trust her. A week later the answer came, a short note, passed through the same intermediary. "Tell her the copy is intact. Waiting on instructions for where to send it so it doesn't disappear like last time." It was the first real piece of evidence in 6 years. Anna let herself feel for a moment something dangerously close to hope. She arranged for the handoff through a trusted courier, a young investigator from a neighbouring district who owed her an old favour. The handoff was set for Tuesday at a small roadside cafe halfway between the city and the camp. On Monday evening, Crane was suddenly ordered onto a training trip to another region. The order came down from corrections headquarters, no explanation, immediate execution. The flash drive stayed in its hiding place, known only to Crane, and the courier came back from the cafe empty-handed. "Someone found out," Anna said over the phone to her assistant, standing by a window, staring out at a grey, joyless city. "Someone found out before we could even make our move. The reckoning came faster than she expected. On Thursday she was called in, not to her direct supervisor, but to the head of internal affairs. "Miss Reeves, a service review has been opened," he said, with no preamble, not even offering her a seat. "Given the time you spent held captive by inmate Reed, questions have arisen about the objectivity of your subsequent testimony and actions. There's reason to believe there may be a degree of emotional involvement that could affect the objectivity of the investigation you're conducting." "That's absurd," Anna said sharply. "You read my report yourself. I documented facts, not emotions." Regardless, pending the outcome of the review, you're being removed from the reforestation fraud case and from any procedural action involving inmate Reed. He held out the order. This isn't a punishment, Miss Reeves. It's procedure. She took the order. Her hands didn't shake. She'd long since learned not to let an enemy see when she was hurting. Tell Gregory, she said quietly, walking out, that procedures end. She didn't add, but the truth doesn't. Out in the hallway, though, she let herself stop at a window for a few seconds, just breathing, fighting that particular feeling of powerlessness that comes when you're right and have no way to prove it. That same morning, in another office in the same building, Sterling called Bell in for a conversation Bell had been dreading since the day he had driven Reed into the city in handcuffs. "Reeves has been suspended," Sterling said, not looking up from his papers. "Good, but it's not enough. The old doctor from the camp took more with him than we thought, and someone clearly helped him figure out he was being listened to. Who knew about the handoff, Andrew? Just me. And the man I had organised the intercept, on your orders. Then the leak is either you or your man." Sterling finally looked up, and in that look Bell saw something he'd never seen directed at him before. Not irritation, not an order, an assessment. The way you'd appraise an asset that had stopped being profitable. "You know, Andrew, 6 years ago you were useful to me, a man willing to do quite a lot for his career. That quality works well as long as the man stays controllable. If you stop being controllable," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I understand," Bell said, feeling a cold sweat run down his back, very much like the sweat he'd felt 6 years earlier, signing a falsified statement. "Then fix it," Sterling said, turning back to his papers. "Andrew, next time there's a leak, I won't bother figuring out whose fault it is. I'll just close the entire matter." The threat was unambiguous. Bell walked out of that office understanding, for the first time in 20 years, that his own safety no longer depended on how useful he was to Sterling. It depended on how quickly he could become more dangerous to his patron than to himself. That same night, Bell bought a simple digital recorder from an electronics store. Not because he'd already decided how he'd use it, but because a man who's been betrayed once starts learning not to trust anyone, not even himself. For more than 2 months, Tom Hunter said nothing about the photo from his trail camera. Then, the second time the local news aired a segment about the dangerous criminal who had held investigator Anna Reeves hostage, something in him gave way. He'd looked at that picture dozens of times, a man carrying a wounded woman in his arms, the wreckage of the helicopter burning behind them in the midday light. There was nothing in that posture that matched a kidnapper. Tom had spent 20 years in those woods, and he could read body language as well as any detective. He didn't go to the local field office. He'd heard too many stories about memory cards disappearing before they reached the right hands. Instead, he reached out to an old contact, a journalist with a national outlet who'd once covered illegal logging in the preserve, and asked to be put in touch with someone who actually investigated things rather than covered for them. The journalist knew Anna Reeves's number. Her name had come up more than once in his own corruption, reporting on the timber industry, always with a note of respect. A principled investigator. The call came to her home phone on a Wednesday evening. "My name's Tom Hunter. I'm a forest ranger at the preserve. I've got a photograph that contradicts what the news is saying about Reed. I think you'll want to see it." They met the next day, not in the city, at a roadside diner along the highway, away from prying eyes. Tom brought not just the memory card with the original image and its timestamp metadata, but a printed patrol log, a document he, as a state employee, was required to keep and in which, in plain black and white, was recorded. Helicopter went down at 11:40 a.m. The log noted the sound of the crash, heard from the ranger station. "Metadata doesn't lie," Tom said, handing Anna the memory card. Timestamp on the photo, 12:03 p.m., 23 minutes after the crash. If he was kidnapping her, he had no reason to carry a wounded woman through snowdrifts on his back. Kidnappers don't do that. Anna held the memory card like it was the most valuable thing she'd had in the past month. In a way, it was. "This isn't enough to reopen the whole case," she admitted honestly, "but it's enough to take apart the new kidnapping charges, and that's half the battle. The other half is sitting in a camp archive on a flash drive currently being guarded by an elderly doctor who just got sent on a forced business trip. Exactly 3 weeks later, the amount of time it took an independent federal aviation panel to finish its technical review, the report on the helicopter crash came in. Anna received a copy not as an active investigator, since her suspension was still in effect, but as a private citizen, a surviving passenger, with a right to know the cause of the crash that killed the pilot. The findings were dry, professional, and explosive, all at once. Damage to the tail rotor's hydraulic system wasn't the result of wear. It was mechanical. A clean cut from a sharp instrument, partially disguised to look like corrosion. The probable cause of the loss of control, deliberate sabotage to the assembly, carried out no more than 2 days before the flight. Someone had wanted that helicopter to never reach Cedar Hollow, and that someone had known in advance exactly who would be on board. Anna read the report 3 times before her hands stopped shaking. Attempted murder of an investigator in the line of duty was no longer just a fraud case. It was a charge that carried real, long sentences, and the one charge that couldn't be buried without an explanation reaching the very top. Crane returned from his training trip in early June, looking older than he had months before, but unbroken. He found his own way to reach her, using the same channel as last time, but this time he didn't pass anything through intermediaries. "Last time I trusted a courier," he said, sitting across from her in her car in an empty lot at the edge of town, the only meeting place they could find without surveillance cameras tied to anything connected to Sterling. "And look how that went. This time I brought it myself." He handed her a small, scratched flash drive, the same one Michael had given him 6 years earlier, wrapped in plastic and hidden in the lining of his old medical bag. "I kept it this whole time because I believed Michael," Crane said. "When they suddenly told me to go 3,500 miles away for retraining with no explanation, I figured I had double the reason to believe him. They don't send a doctor with 30 years of experience on retraining without explanation and without the right to refuse unless something's wrong." Anna plugged the drive into her laptop right there in the car, not waiting for a safer moment. The files opened without trouble, scanned documents, photographs of financial reports, printed and scanned email correspondence, all compiled by Ellen Reed over the 2 months before her death. Direct evidence of the fake reforestation contracts, the scheme laundering funds through Cascade Forestry Group, and, most importantly, a copy of the formal report Ellen had filed with her superiors, with a handwritten note, forward to Sterling personally, confidential, initialed GS, the same initials Anna had seen for months scattered across dozens of documents in her own reforestation case. It was the signature of a man who, 6 years ago, had known about the existence of compromising documents long before Ellen Reed died on that forest road. "There's the motive," Anna whispered. "Not just fear of an old case resurfacing. Direct proof that he knew about the embezzlement in advance and personally made sure the information never got out. This changes everything. This isn't covering up an old investigative mistake. This is the organized elimination of a witness and the fabrication of a criminal case to hide a serious financial crime." Bell's recording reached her unexpectedly. He called her himself, late one night, in the voice of a man who had finally understood that the fear of exposure was less terrifying than the fear of being sacrificed by the man he served. "I need to meet with you," he said, not as an investigator to a suspect, but as a man who'd once been friends with Reed and owed him a debt that money couldn't repay. They met in his car at the same deserted lot that had already become something like neutral ground in this quiet war. "I recorded a conversation," Bell said, handing her his phone, the file ready to play. "2 weeks ago, Sterling told me straight out that if there's another leak, he'll close the matter on me completely. I understood right then that to him I'm disposable, just like Reed was 6 years ago. The difference is Reed had a conscience to keep him from giving up. All I ever had was self-interest. And now there's no self-interest left, just danger." Anna played the recording. Sterling's voice, instantly recognizable, cold, without a trace of emotion, discussing the camp doctor, controlling the search teams, and at one point answering Bell's direct question about Reed's 6-year-old case, saying the line that settled everything. "That case was closed correctly, Andrew. We both know Reed happened to be in the right place. The place where we needed someone guilty. It's not my fault he found his wife's flash drive before we could get to it first." "That's a direct confession," Anna said, feeling her hands tremble. "A confession to fabricating a criminal case." "I know." Bell stared out the window, not at her. "And I know I'll be tried too for giving false testimony 6 years ago. I'm ready for that. Better to serve time for what I actually did than keep paying for it my whole life as someone else's property." With evidence like this in hand, Ellen Reed's financial documents, the technical report confirming deliberate sabotage of the helicopter, the ranger's photograph and patrol log disproving the kidnapping narrative, and the recorded confession of a deputy state attorney, Anna understood that going to the regional bureau would be pointless. Too much of it was tied to Sterling through personal and professional threads. She went straight to the Federal Oversight Division of the State Bureau of Investigation, the body that existed precisely for cases where a regional investigation became impossible due to corruption within the region itself. Through an old mentor who'd been promoted to a position in the capital 5 years earlier, and still held her in high regard, she secured a personal meeting with the deputy director of the division. The review took another 2 weeks. Federal investigators took their time double-checking every document, interviewing Crane, Tom Hunter, the aviation experts, requesting the old case files. By early August, a criminal case had officially been opened against Gregory Sterling on charges of fabricating evidence, abuse of office, organizing an attempted murder of an investigator in the line of duty, and the attempted elimination of inmate Reed by transferring him to a deliberately hazardous worksite. Reed's case was sent up for review, with a motion for the immediate reversal of his conviction based on new evidence. The hearing was set for January 15th. The date wasn't a coincidence. On that same day, in that same regional courthouse, a formal ceremony was scheduled to present the candidates competing for State Attorney General, with national reporters invited. The federal investigators chose that date on purpose. Sterling, expecting his moment of triumph in front of the cameras, would instead find himself in a building full of witnesses at the exact moment everything came to light. Too many powerful people, too many reporters in one place at one time. The best possible defense against any last-minute attempt to bury the case. Michael learned of the upcoming review not from Anna. Correspondence with her had been forbidden while the inquiry was ongoing, but from his lawyer, a new one assigned by the Federal Division, who told him simply, "A review is being prepared. A hearing's been scheduled. Be ready." He didn't let himself feel hope. After 6 years, he'd heard too many promises that led nowhere to trust words without results. He learned about Sterling's recorded confession, about Ellen's flash drive, about the ranger's photograph. But to him, sitting alone in a cell, all of it was still abstract. Facts on paper he couldn't verify with his own hands. The one thing that felt real was the cold metal of the dog tag he clenched in his fist every night before sleep, and a quiet, stubborn hope that the woman who had held so much of someone else's pain in her hands for 3 weeks in the wilderness wouldn't betray him the way his best friend once had. On January 15th, the Regional Hall of Justice buzzed like a disturbed hive. On the 3rd floor in a large hall, preparations were underway for the ceremonial introduction of the candidates for State Attorney General. Reporters set up cameras, officials in formal suits shook hands, and Gregory Sterling, in a flawlessly tailored new suit, rehearsed in front of a mirror in the VIP room, the exact same composed, confident smile he planned to wear for the press in an hour. On the 2nd floor in the courtroom, there was far less polish and far more silence. The particular kind of silence that settles in right before something irreversible is about to happen. The room, usually half empty for routine oversight hearings, was unusually full that day. A handful of locals who'd read about it in the regional paper, district prosecutor's office staff with no direct stake in the case, but who'd heard the rumours, and a couple of reporters who'd wandered in more out of curiosity than assignment. Michael Reed was brought into the courtroom in cuffs, under guard, a formality kept up to the very end, even though the kidnapping charges had already been formally dropped the week before, following Tom Hunter's testimony and the analysis of the photo's metadata. He sat down on the defendant's bench, straightened his back, and, for the first time in 6 years, allowed himself to look out at the room without fear. Anna sat in the 2nd row in a sharp, dark suit, a folder of documents on her lap, holding it the way someone holds something worth risking a career for. Beside her, Crane, who'd flown in the day before on a special flight, at the invitation of the Federal Division. A little further down, Tom Hunter, unusually stiff in an unfamiliar suit instead of his ranger uniform. In the back row, sitting apart from everyone, Andrew Bell, already officially a defendant in his own case, but who had agreed to testify as a witness as part of a deal with prosecutors. The presiding judge declared the session open. The prosecutor, representing the Federal Division, rose to lay out the new evidence in the case. "Your Honour," he began, "through this motion, we present evidence that contradicts the conviction handed down 6 years ago against Michael Reed on a charge of murder. The evidence includes financial documentation discovered by the victim, Ellen Reed, shortly before her death, a technical report establishing the cause of a subsequent aircraft crash, an audio recording in which a state official confesses to fabricating a criminal case, and the testimony of a witness who, 6 years ago, gave false testimony under pressure from that same official." The room went even quieter. Somewhere in the hallway, oblivious to what was unfolding on the 2nd floor, someone laughed, an echo of the festive bustle 1 floor up where Sterling's coronation was being prepared. Anna rose when the judge called her to testify. "I'm Senior Investigator Anna Reeves. I'm investigating a scheme to embezzle reforestation funds, in the course of which I established the direct involvement of Deputy State Attorney Gregory Sterling in covering up a crime and fabricating the criminal case against Michael Reed 6 years ago." Her voice was calm, professional, without a single tremor, even though everything inside her was shaking. "On February 11th of last year, a helicopter I was travelling in to interview a witness in this case crashed as the result of deliberate damage to its hydraulic system. I was saved by the man currently sitting on that bench. For 3 weeks, He treated an open fracture of my shin in the wilderness with no medication, no instruments, no professional assistance of any kind, and he saved my life at the risk of his own freedom and his own safety. When the search team found us, his actions were reported as a kidnapping, not a rescue. She opened her folder. I asked the court to admit the technical report on the helicopter crash, confirming deliberate sabotage. I asked the court to admit the documents recovered from the digital storage device provided by camp physician Dr. Paul Crane, confirming that the late Ellen Reed discovered the embezzlement scheme and formally reported it. And I asked the court to admit the audio recording in which Deputy State Attorney Gregory Sterling directly confesses that the case against Reed was fabricated to conceal that scheme. In the doorway, unnoticed at first, appeared a man no one had expected to see in that room at that particular moment. Gregory Sterling walked in uninvited, with security in tow, after learning from his aides that something connected to the old Reed case was unfolding 2 floors below, a case he had considered closed and forgotten long ago. He couldn't simply step aside and let his lawyers handle it. In an hour, he was due to face national reporters at his own coronation, and any rumour that he was hiding out while his name was being spoken under oath in the same building would damage his career faster than the hearing itself ever could. So he was counting on one simple thing, that his presence, his rank, his confidence would instantly shut down any provocation before it gained traction. That's how it had always worked. That's how it had worked for 6 years. "My apologies, Your Honour," he said from the doorway, his voice as even as always, maybe just a touch faster than usual. "I happened to learn of this hearing and felt it was my duty to clarify the situation. The case from 6 years ago was closed in strict accordance with the law, and I'm prepared to confirm that personally." The judge looked at him coldly. "Mr. Sterling, your presence at this hearing is remarkably well timed, given that your name appears directly in the materials submitted by the prosecution." Sterling felt something inside him, the very self-assured calm his entire career had been built on, crack for the first time in 20 years. "I don't understand what you're referring to." The federal prosecutor nodded, and the recording was played in open court. Sterling's voice, his own voice, recognizable, cold, filled the courtroom. "That case was closed correctly, Andrew. We both know Reed happened to be in the right place, the place where we needed someone guilty. It's not my fault he found his wife's flash drive before we could get to it first." Sterling's face drained of colour so fast that one reporter, who had slipped into the room hoping for a different kind of headline from the coronation upstairs, would later write, "I have never seen a man lose his colour that quickly, as if someone had simply let the air out of him." This is fabricated," Sterling forced out, stepping back though no one had moved toward him. "The recording underwent independent forensic analysis for signs of editing. The findings are attached," the prosecutor said calmly. "In addition, we have the testimony of witness Andrew Bell, who is prepared to confirm the content of that conversation in person." Andrew Bell rose from the back row, slowly, heavily, like a man finally settling a debt that had been accumulating for 20 years. "I confirm it," he said, not looking at Sterling. "I was there. I heard every word, and I'm prepared to tell this court everything I know about a 6-year-old case in which I myself gave false testimony under threats from this man." Sterling looked around for his aides, the people who, a minute earlier, had been standing by, ready to back up anything he said. One looked away and took a step toward the exit. The other pulled out his phone as if he'd suddenly remembered urgent business somewhere else in the building. No one would meet his eyes. That's how power built on fear, rather than respect, ends. It evaporates the moment the threat behind it disappears. "Gregory Sterling," the judge said. In light of the evidence now before this court, the court considers it necessary to notify the law enforcement officers present of grounds for your detention. 2 agents from the State Bureau of Investigation, who had been waiting at the courtroom doors for exactly this moment, their presence coordinated in advance after federal investigators secured a detention warrant the night before, approached Sterling. One of them placed handcuffs on him with the same indifferent efficiency that had been used to cuff Reed in the snow 6 years earlier. Sterling didn't resist. He simply stood there, staring into empty space, small for the first time in his life. As Sterling was led out of the courtroom, the presiding judge turned back to the main matter of the hearing, as if to tell everyone present, the main event of the day hasn't ended. It's only just begun. Having reviewed the new evidence presented, the judge said, the court finds it proven that the criminal case against Michael Reed was fabricated. The room fell so silent you could hear a car passing somewhere outside the windows. The guilty verdict under the first-degree murder statute is hereby vacated. Michael Reed is declared not guilty and is to be released from custody immediately. The same officer who had cuffed him on the day of his first arrest after the plane crash now removed the handcuffs himself, without a word, and in that silent gesture there was more of an apology than any official's statement could ever hold. Michael sat still for a few seconds, not quite believing the metal no longer held his wrists. Then slowly, like a man learning to walk again, he rose from the defendant's bench. Anna was the first to come to him. She didn't say anything dramatic, none of the lines people say in movies. She just held out her hand, and he gripped it the way he'd once gripped the dog tag in the dark of his cell, tight, grateful, unwilling to let go of the one support he had left. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not being afraid to believe me." "Thank you," she answered, "for teaching me to see the difference between guilty and convenient." An hour later, on the 3rd floor of the same building in the hall meant to host the ceremonial introduction of the new candidate for State Attorney General, an unscheduled press conference from the State Bureau of Investigation took place instead of the celebration. A criminal case has been opened against former Deputy State Attorney Gregory Sterling on charges of fabricating evidence, abuse of office, organizing an attempt on the life of a state investigator, and attempting to eliminate inmate Michael Reed by transferring him to a knowingly hazardous work assignment, a representative of the Federal Bureau announced to the assembled reporters, many of whom had arrived an hour earlier expecting to write a completely different story. It was also established, the representative continued, that the fabrication had been intended to conceal a large-scale scheme to embezzle public funds allocated for forest restoration, with the damages preliminarily estimated at more than $5 million over the period since the scheme began. The ceremony to introduce the candidates for State Attorney General, the very reason the reporters had gathered that day, has been postponed indefinitely. Cameras clicked through the room, but not for the man they'd originally come to photograph. By morning, the representative added, former investigator Andrew Bell, who had cooperated with the inquiry and provided key evidence, was also named as a defendant in a related case for giving knowingly false testimony 6 years earlier. The extent of his liability would be determined by the court, taking into account his active cooperation in uncovering the crime. 3 months passed. The cemetery on the edge of the town was dusted with April's snow, already half melted, but not gone entirely, when Michael Reed visited Ellen's grave for the first time in 6 years, without handcuffs, without an escort. He didn't bring flowers. In winter, none could be found alive, but a small sprig of cedar, broken off in the very wilderness that had once hidden him from the world and given him a second chance. He set the sprig on the cold stone, ran a finger over the letters of her engraved name, and took off the dog tag he'd worn around his neck for 15 years without ever removing it. He opened the clasp, pulled the photograph out from beneath the cracked glass, the same one of her laughing on the riverbank, and carefully placed it inside a small metal locket he'd had made specially, meant to stay there at the stone forever. "I found the truth, Ellen," he said quietly. "Took a long time, but I found it. Now your name doesn't stand for a victim. It stands for someone who wasn't afraid to speak." Further off, near the cemetery gate, a car was waiting. Anna didn't come closer. This moment didn't belong to her, and she understood that. But when Michael finally turned and started walking toward the gate, she stepped out to meet him, and they simply walked together, side by side, saying nothing. Because some things between two people who've been through what they went through don't need words at all. "What now?" she finally asked, once they'd gotten into the car. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "For 6 years I knew exactly one thing: survive. Now I'll have to learn how to know something else." "You have time," she said. "You have a life. That's already a lot." He nodded, and for the first time in a long while there was no wariness in his eyes. None of the guardedness he'd lived with for years. Only the tired, quiet calm of a man for whom the storm had finally ended. That same day, in a federal detention facility outside the regional capital, the attempted murder case against an investigator was transferred to the federal level to rule out any possibility of interference from regional connections. Sterling sat on a hard bunk in a cell built for 4, though, for security reasons, he had no cellmates. Through a barred window near the ceiling, a narrow wedge of daylight pushed through, exactly the kind of light that had once fallen across Michael Reed's face in his own cell, 6 years earlier. Only this time, Sterling had never once stopped to wonder what it might feel like to look at that light, without knowing how many more years you had left to see it. His lawyer, at their last meeting, informed him that not a single one of his former colleagues, men who'd carried out his orders for years without question, had submitted a statement of support. Dana Lake, the assistant who had once quietly photographed documents out of an instinct she couldn't fully explain, gave a full, detailed statement to investigators and was promoted into the state's Rule of Law Oversight Division, the very department where Anna Reeves had once started her own career. Tom Hunter went back to his trail cameras and his Martins. He didn't show up to the ceremony where he was presented with a letter of commendation from the State Bureau of Investigation. He told them over the phone that the rutting season had started in the backcountry, and that unlike people, you can't explain to wildlife that the ranger has urgent business in the city. Outside the window, snow fell soft and indifferent to human tragedy, the same as it had 6 years before. The wilderness doesn't remember who fell and who survived. It simply keeps growing, year after year, burying both the truth and the lies beneath the snow until someone finally finds the courage to dig up what's been hidden. Michael Reed found that courage in himself, and the wilderness that once saved his life ultimately helped him save the truth as well. If this story moved you, give it a like. It's the best support you can give this channel. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next story about justice, the kind that always finds its way through, even through the deepest wilderness. And tell me what you think. Should a person who once betrayed someone for the sake of their career get a second chance if their decision later helps uncover a far bigger crime? Or is betrayal something no future action can ever make, right? Leave your answer in the comments.